Yes, we do look forward to that time when that will be presented much later today. But the president was at the economic summit yesterday, where he made some recommendations. And to speak about some of those highlights, which the president did speak about, we have Mr. Bukar Kari, former chairman NESG. He joins us from our studios in Abuja. Good morning, Mr. Kari. Thank you for joining us today. Well, it's grabbing the headlines, what the president did say. Few people in 5 states, FCT, own Nigeria's wealth. How did you receive that when you heard it?
Chamberlain, there was a chuckle in the Congress Hall, and obviously, the way I characterize it is that in a free market society, you'd find the people that are fortunate or gritty enough, as in GRIT, enough to make the best of the situation in the economy and make themselves quite wealthy. I wouldn't call those 5 as holding Nigeria's wealth. I would just say that they have made themselves quite wealthy in a market-driven economy. So the desire is that we should see millions and millions of young people that should aspire to emulate that and to become millionaires or billionaires in Naira terms.
Also talked about promoting inclusiveness. Yes, he's consistently harping on lifting people out of poverty, getting that spread, collective prosperity. How do you see that principle playing out if they want to go about implementing such, if it were to be a policy?
Right. What has happened with the summit itself, if one looks at the theme of the summit, and I may want to put a disclaimer here that I'm not, as a former chairman and a former board member, I do believe that I am trying my best to explain what the summit theme is, but I think the summit organizers and the leaders of the Nigerian Economic Summit may later on in the day articulate the position. But clearly the theme of the summit was situated around Nigeria 2050, shifting gears. And I believe that the shifting gear part or the shifting gears part is where we need to pay particular attention, especially the role of the private sector and the public sector in taking things forward. And if we want to take those 94 million or over 94 million people that are in abject poverty, we need to do certain things differently. I mean, I think it's Einstein that mentioned that if you keep repeating the same thing and expect a different result, that would be the definition of insanity. As a country, we've been doing the same things over and over again, and it had not taken us out of the mess that we have found ourselves economically speaking. And therefore, we need to change and shift gears. We need to pay attention in managing our demography, the population growth. We need to also look at industrialization as the key to creating jobs, rather than just pick one sector of the economy and say those have the potential to create a lot of jobs. How? And the faster rate of industrialization, as had been demonstrated by similar countries over a period of 30 to 40 years, South Korea, for example, or Singapore, or bringing it home in a nation like even Ethiopia fairly recently, there are effects of those deliberate, purposeful economic policies that have seen them improving their livelihoods. And clearly, that we need to also transform our educational system. It doesn't make sense for us to have a university graduate that cannot function and that do not have the necessary skills to participate in the next wave of what one might call the digital economy, where artificial intelligence, machine learning, and so on and so forth are going to be the bane of the immediate future. Now, our own estimates is that graduates in Nigeria, in the STEM graduates, meaning science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are less than, I believe they are less than 5 or 10% of the total number of graduates. I believe it's about 5%. Now, that does not, that does not tell, give us a rosy future, because 20 years from now, those are the people that would be competing with the rest of the world. So we need to also transform our education and our educational system such that there should be emphasis on certain life skills, certain technical skills, and also even in the methodology of training our youth, we need to make sure that we've adjusted that. And lastly, the last part was in terms of achieving sustainable peace and security. I believe that it is only when you have economic policies that would lift everybody out of poverty that you would begin to then see a certain sense of contentment and peaceful coexistence amongst ourselves and between us and our neighbors. And unless those issues are addressed, it's not force that brings about peace and security. It is economic well-being and also the fact that the country, citizens need to look out for each other. So those are some of the key themes that this year's summit is trying to address. And of course, at the end of the summit, there would be recommendations that would be made to the Federal Executive Council.
All right, we will take a look at some more of those recommendations. I think some, Mr. Rotimi as well did reference some of them, but we'll see how far we can go with that when we'll come back in a moment. Don't go away. Welcome back to Sunrise Daily. Well, let's get back to Mr. Kari, former chairman of the NASG and former board member. But when the president talked about, the policies must also ensure it includes or provides for inclusiveness, and then presently, what do you think we can currently achieve? I know you referenced education, and the NASG, I remember, they did focus solely on education, almost dissected in such that all the country needed to do was just implement that document. So where are we, first of all, from that particular summit that the NSG had about education? Do you think we've made significant improvements, or has that impacted our state of education at the moment?
I think the unfortunate thing is that we haven't continued with that momentum of the education-themed summit that we had 5 or so years back. Now, the key thing that is of note is that the dynamics of the global economy are changing, and we need to adapt and adapt very quickly. Education being one of those things that politicians may not like to invest in a great deal, because there are no ribbons to cut, right? Because it's a very silent investment that takes a long time for you to see the returns. Now, again, there are two things. Studies globally have demonstrated that to lift a larger percentage of your population out of poverty from a low income to a middle income bracket, there are two fundamental sectors that you need to invest in a great deal. One is healthcare, the second is education. Those two, if you manage to consistently invest in them over a period of time, of course, with free market economy, inclusivity in the economic policies, et cetera, then you begin to see that the citizens become more resourceful. Nigerians, as a practice, anywhere in the world that they go to, turn out to be extremely creative, extremely hardworking, and unless the exception being here. But even here, we do find, you know, spots where I call them the, uh, rays of hope here and there that have emerged and have done some wonderful things, especially the young people that have gone into fintechs and technology areas, software development. But I haven't seen a lot in the hardware area, and that is because it requires a lot more capital and guidance for us to succeed. But I have seen areas where Nigerians can take advantage of. And we just need to be purposeful, deliberate in the pursuit. But clearly, the bane of transforming a society rests on those two basic foundations, which is the investment in education and the investment in healthcare.
You said the other time that we failed to sustain momentum on some recommendations that were made in the past, and consequently, whatever achievement we were supposed to have made, we have not been able to make. Now, you are saying that this economic summit that is going on now is going to produce some recommendations that will be presented to the federal government. What's the assurance that that's going to make any difference?
Well, we will, because it's a collection of people, both from the private sector and public sector, coming together. In fact, there were, oh gosh, there were probably over 30 different design workshops that took place yesterday. And there would also be continuation. Apart from the plenary sessions, which are usually broadcast live, there are the breakout sessions that started somewhere around 2 p.m. Up to 6:30 p.m., where they were done in two chunks in various different rooms in the Transcorp. And it touched on basically every aspect of the economy. From human capital to regulatory areas for in logistics, you know, just name them. A whole host of experts that have come from within and outside Nigeria, plus also public sector people. So the coming together, bringing out those recommendations were done in conjunction with some members of the public sector that are stakeholders in those conversations. Now, the recommendations that then come out of that would be presented to the Federal Executive Council. Is there a guarantee that 100% of those recommendations would be taken? I would be surprised if that happens. But going by historical trends, some of them may be adopted and others may not. But what we are trying to stress, and what every Nigerian ought to be pushing for, is that there is a need for us as a nation to have a sense of urgency. The last 3 or 4 years, we've been growing at sub 2% per year, where our population, on the other hand, is growing at 2.6% per year. So even if we had not, even if inflation was zero and we do not have any inflation, we would still have lost ground in terms of the average per capita income. Now, you throw that in 10% or 11% inflation rate, then we are really slipping down a slippery slope. So what we are saying is that the players, both in the public sector and the private sector, need to come together with a certain sense of urgency in terms of adopting these policies to make sure that we create a larger pie. By the way, we are spending so much time and energy on the federal government, but mind you, we have 36 state governments and 774 local governments. Now, those are the ones that are closer to you and I as citizens, and meaning the subnationals. And the subnationals need to be plugged into this conversation, and whether it is at the National Executive Council or any other means, the governors and the local government councils need to be a part of this conversation, because at the end of the day, they do matter a great deal, rather than someone sitting in Abuja dictating things outward. So clearly, the recommendations will be made, the documents will be available electronically, as well as also some hard copies would be delivered for some of us that are digitally challenged. But
Well
clearly
said,
what is
Mr.
going to
Kari.
happen is
Well
that
said.
those recommendations.
You know, I'm just wondering because, you know, the state's component in terms of the budgetary provisions, what they need to do to ensure that, I mean, those subnationals bring a lot to the table. But, you know, in spite of all the conversations we had previously about how important it is for those states to also stand up and be counted. But if you remember, when we had flood disaster in some of these states, they couldn't even tackle, they said they were incapacitated. They didn't have the capacity to handle all of those. So the federal government had to wade in. And not just that, they had to wade in for salaries, they had to wade in for a lot of other items. So assuming that the states were able to, at least maybe the state houses of assembly, hold them accountable to a large extent, what kind of impact do you think they can ever make, given these incapacitation that they claim to have?
That's beyond the scope of this year's summit, I would imagine. The key thing about the subnationals and whether they are economically viable or not is a conversation that I know you've had at the previous segment, but it's something that we need to have as a major item to discuss as a nation, and that is whether is it optimal for us to have 36 states, or should we actually go down to a manageable size? The cost of governance, as espoused by Senator Rochers in your earlier segment, also is something that we need to candidly put on the table and discuss, because when you look at the numbers, it just doesn't make sense unless those are, candidly addressed. We may still be just cleaning the deck of the Titanic, or shuffling the chairs on the deck of the Titanic, as one of my old professors would say, because the major item that we need to also look at is the cost that is tied to governance. But that aside, I think what we have to look at is that the subnationals, both the states and the local governments, are where things take place, because that's where primary schools are funded. That's where all other things are done. For things like natural disasters, majority of the natural disasters that take place these days are predictive. I mean, we know that the rainy season cycles, and we know that if you do not clean up and you are not prepared, you would be inundated with floods and so on and so forth. So that actually tells you that our the desire to sit down and plan for something that would eventually come anyway is lacking. And that's another topic altogether, about planning and being in preparation and forecasting. So majority of the natural disasters that hit Nigeria are predictable, short of those earth tremors that took place somewhere near Abuja a year or 2 years ago. So the preparedness of the states ought to also be part of those plans that they need to put in place, and they need to sensitize their citizens before a disaster hits.
Okay, Mr.
And
Kari.
of course, if they don't have the
If I may,
capacity, the federal...
If I may now, let me bring you back to the scope of the summit. And we understand, the theme is Nigeria 2050, shifting gears, I believe. 2050, that's the same time the United Nations projects that Nigeria's population will double from the projected 200 million, or the estimated 200 million, to 400 million. Now, at this stage, there are projections that says about 94 million Nigerians are in poverty. I don't want to project that for 2050. But then, in the context of this summit, from the interactions you have seen so far, what picture are we painting for Nigeria for 2050?
So exactly. So the prediction basically is that we will be the third most populous nation on earth, surpassing the U.S. and I believe one other country so far in the list. And the key thing is that that population can either be an asset or a liability, and so the critical pieces that theme of the 2050 shifting gears theme is addressing are those critical things. Transformation of the education is one of those things that I think we've spent quite a deal of discussions on. The other is industrialization, because nobody can develop with an import and appetite of just consumption without necessarily producing those things that they consume. So the key is to have a purposeful, deliberate industrialization policy that lifts everybody out. But you cannot have a trajectory on industrial development if you do not have people that have the capacity to cope with those tools that are needed in being productive. So again, we come back to the issue of the education. And of course, then with building that wealth and growing those economies, we have to grow at probably close to double digit for a long time to lift everybody out of poverty. So we are now knocking on nearly 100 million people in poverty. That's close to 50% of the population. And if we project out and just extrapolate that out to the 400 million population, then it would either be less than that 94 million or 95 million that we have that are living in abject poverty to something meaningful, if not eliminate, at least reduce it to a manageable small amount, or we may be seeing something more disastrous.
Okay.
And I would not, as stated in yesterday's, or one of the yesterday's session, hope is not a strategy. So, but I still would say I do not hope. I hope that we are not on the other side of the ledger.
Maybe one way, Mr. Kari, maybe one way that we can incorporate hope in strategy is that we can just hope that our strategy works. But I don't know how that plays out, in the number of figures that we have had over time. On the one hand, of course, you have talked about the number of people that are in poverty, and the figures are most likely to grow as the population grows, unless we do something about it. We know what the unemployment figures are saying, and we know that that is one of the reasons that the number of inactive bank accounts in Nigeria have increased to 47 million, according to the Nigeria Interbank settlement system. And we also know that there are about some 37 million micro businesses in Nigeria now. I'm sure that many of them may have also fallen into bankruptcy, because one of the reasons given for inactive bank accounts is economic downturn, failed businesses, and job losses, according to one of the big banks that was quoted. So in your own estimation, Mr. Kari, how do we reverse this trend? Because by 2050, that's 20 years from now, 20 years ago, we started democracy. In 20 years' time, where do you see us being, and what must we do now? You've talked about education and health. How about the micro, small, and medium businesses? What must they do, or what must be done now for this sector to jumpstart the economy? Because I don't see how we'll be able to fix the economy without the micro, small, and medium businesses.
Yes, the attention has to be paid to the micro, small and medium enterprises space. But when you have an industrial policy as a nation, it's not about putting together a refinery or huge manufacturing entities. We can also go down as low as a one-person business. So even at the micro level, you can still have industrialization. I think the key example of a nation that have gone through that sort of transformation is, I believe, Indonesia, where a lot of economists then were saying that with the growth in terms of industrialization, some of the craftspeople that were doing things, one or two people working together to produce certain widgets or certain products would be wiped off. What had happened is that they actually upped their game, and they ended up becoming the suppliers to some of those industries that they ended up creating in some of the cluster areas. So at the end of the day, those family-owned micro or small enterprises also adapted and grew with that. The case that we have in Nigeria today is a situation where the economy was shrinking, or economy had shrunk, and as a result, people that relied on certain trades ended up being caught, or in some cases, they were caught by the currency devaluation that took place 5 or 6 years back, and so on and so forth. So those are people that have not quite fully recovered yet. And of course, with a with a dynamic economy, what happens is that some people would fail and then go back and use that as a lesson and restart and continue to make a difference. And that is just natural. As human beings, we are made to have a life that is purposeful. And many people have gone through downturns and those cycles, and then, pick themselves up by the bootstraps and continue to make a difference. Now, the only situation that would create such sort of environment is a country where the economic policies or the industrialization policies are clear, well articulated, and the citizens are knowledgeable about those, and they can take advantage of that.
All right,
So
let's.
it's a situation where
Mr. Gary,
in the next, yeah, go
my
ahead.
apologies. Just pardon me. We'll come back to you in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back, and it's our concluding moments now. So, Mr. Kari, could you give us an insight into the thinking of the NASG, if you can? Because if we are where we are in terms of our population and look at the challenges that the country is facing, and then by 2050, if we happen to be the third most populous country in the world, that's going to be huge. So there'll be a question about, is infrastructure development commensurate with that of population development commensurate with that of the economic growth? There will be so many things that will play out at that time. So this summit, is it a one-off focus on 2050, or is it a subsequent summit? There will be that reminder that, look, we're not doing enough in terms of preparing ourselves for the future, because by that time, it'll be huge. We'll talk about lifting people out of poverty, but what commensurate attention are we paying to education? Are we increasing the budgetary fund to education year on year? Are the states playing their role? So what is it thinking? Is it one-off or what?
There has to be sustained effort in keeping up with some of the, what I would call medium to long-term plans. Nigeria stopped doing 5-year plans quite a while ago. And I think when you look at the target for 2050, it's 30 years, therefore it's within one generation. that we want to see a transformation take place. Now, the danger with a long-term plan is that people will begin to procrastinate and just sit and say, well, we have a lot of time. We do not. So there should be and there must be a sense of urgency in execution. So in executing the plans. And that need to start right off the bat. So whether the themes of the next set of summits change and is not quite looking at 2050, we should have that line of sight. So that target ought to always be there. And whether it's going to be a sectional or themes or an overall theme like this one, there should be a reminder to the policymakers that we should not be distracted by things that may happen that would basically take us off the target. Now, 2050 is only 30 years from now. The other thing is that the growth rate of the GDP is still subpar. We need to accelerate our growth. We can look inwards in doing that, or we may look inwards in doing that. We may also address some of those structural inadequacies in the economy. You know, in the earlier sessions, there were discussions of tackling certain key things, including how we can go about dealing with fuel subsidy, the size of the cost of governance, et cetera, et cetera. Now, those are things that we cannot run away from. And I do believe that as we go on to the next sets of summits, those things that are going to be, you know, hitting us as the time changes are going to be the ones that would be put into focus so that the long term should not be jettisoned, but at the same time, we need to address some of the immediate one.
All right,
you know,
then.
the problem with urgent response in making a long-term plan is that we should still be able to sharpen those acts as we go on.
Yeah.
Go on in that journey, but at the same time then address some of the lower hanging fruits.
Okay.
So education becomes important, healthcare becomes important, but clearly electricity, some of the basic infrastructure,
that's going to
all
be
of those are very, very important and need
going
to be addressed.
concern, a consistently big matter that needs to be sorted if we need to make the kind of, achieve the kind of growth that we really yearn for. Always a pleasure to have you on, Mr. Bukar Kari, former chairman and board member of the NESG. Well, that is the show today. We thank you all for watching. We'll see you tomorrow. I'm Chamberlain. So
I am Kari.
And I'm Ayo Makine. Have a wonderful day.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this program are those of the maker and do not reflect the views, opinions, and endorsement of Channels Television.